Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day, wherever and whenever you're listening, we welcome you to the CES Letters podcast. I'm so hyped for this episode today, and we have the incredible guest of Dr. Stephen C. Harper. Today, Steve's going to be talking to us all about the Book of Mormon Translation and what that entailed. We'll be diving into the CES Letter, and we'll be discussing the questions and concerns about the Book of Mormon Translation. Steve is a covenant son of God who strives to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. He's a professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University. He is the editor-in-chief of BYU Studies, an executive editor of the Wilford Woodruff Papers, and from 2012 to 2018, he was the managing historian and a general editor of Saints, the Story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was also a volume editor of the Joseph Smith Papers. Steve is a good friend of mine, and he has some incredible insights. Now, as always, I would like to remind and really exhort you guys, this podcast isn't going to answer every single one of your questions and concerns. If you really want to know the answer, you need to put forth serious study and serious prayer. These, again, are spiritual matters we'll be talking about that you can learn intellectually, sure, but you also need to learn spiritually. So if you really want to know the answers to some of these questions and concerns, continue your study by going to the show notes and reading the article that Steve has written about this topic. Without further ado, I present to you the Book of Mormon Translation with Steve Harper. Steve, How are you doing today?
I'm well, Easton. How are you, sir?
Good. I'm glad.
Good
Steve,
to be with you again.
It's good for you to. I'm glad you're here. It's good for you to be here. The last couple of episodes were really good, and I'll tell you what, we have not got that much criticism out of them. So you must have done a pretty good job.
Yeah. Or nobody cares, but let's hope it's the other one.
Let's hope it's the other one. I'd also like to point out, with some of our other podcasts, the microphone system wasn't as good. The visual system wasn't as good, but we're finally getting up there. We're getting up there in the world. Exactly. Steve, as we get started, I want to get to know you a little bit, and I want the audience to recognize who you are. And so my first question to you is, if you could have any superpower, what would it be?
That is tough because I think all of them come with unintended consequence, baggage,
sure.
Along with the power. I would have the power to be able to understand what my wife and other women mean and are thinking. Because over the 30 years or so of my marriage, I've become better at hearing and understanding, but I am really thick.
Sure.
And it's taken me a long time to pick up on pretty basic cues and clues. So is that a superpower?
I would say that's a superpower.
Okay. I would like that one.
I think that's one that could change the world if men could learn it.
Yeah, sensitivity, maybe? Is that a...
Sure,
a Captain Sensitivity or something? Is that
sure.
Okay.
We'll call it that.
All right, that sounds good.
Perfect. Steve, you are, when it comes to Joseph Smith, to church history, to Jesus Christ, you are one of the foremost experts in the church. Now, how in the world do you go from just being some normal kid to putting all of this time and effort and knowledge into so many things?
Well, there's so much at stake,
sure.
right? I like to spend my life where the stakes are highest. And there's so much at stake. First of all, is there a God? Is there meaning and purpose in life? That's the first question. And if there is a God, then is Jesus the Son of God, right? And then if Jesus is the Son of God, is Joseph Smith his prophet? Those are all enormously consequential questions. And I have to know the answers to those questions and related questions. So whether I did what I do for money or not, for a living, I would do what I do because I have to know the truth about these things insofar as we're able to know. And I've learned that you can know, but only if you're willing to exercise faith and simultaneously work really hard with your brain work and spiritual work. Some people think that the gospel just prescribes spiritual work. Just pray about it. Nuh-uh. There's 100 words in that formula from Moroni. And they call forth brain work. Read, remember, ponder, right? The Doctrine and Covenants formulation is seek learning out of the best books by study and also by faith. It's the combination of our spiritual capacities, God-given abilities that way, and our God-given intellects that we need to combine. Rationale by its own self is faulty. Spirituality, if that's all we trust in, we're liable to make mistakes, be deceived. So the revealed formulas are for hard brain work combined with hard spiritual work, including repenting, exercising faith. And I have just found that life of the mind and life of the soul and the spirit to be the most satisfying way to live that I can imagine. So that's my answer.
I think that's a great answer. Something I want to circle back to that you mentioned that I think would be good to know for many of our listeners is you say we need to study out of the best books.
Yeah.
What are the best books to you?
Well, what we want here is a scholar would call this source criticism, right? Sources of knowledge. So what sources of knowledge exist and what knowledge do they have in them? And how can I get that knowledge out of them? Can I trust them? So books, yeah, fine. But I mean here, primarily primary sources, right? Mm-hmm. I want the fewest possible layers between me and the source of truth I'm seeking. So ultimately, I want to go directly to God. Mm-hmm. I want confirmation to me directly from God. So for example, I study the Book of Mormon. It's certainly one of the best books, the Bible, the revelations to Joseph Smith. But I need to go back to the raw sources of those books as much as I possibly can. And I've done that, right? And lots of other people have done that. So that's what I think of as the best books. The Joseph Smith papers give us access to him, 1,588 pages of his journals. The 33 or so that are in his handwriting are better than the ones that aren't, right? So the best books are, we could talk all day about them. People should be interested enough in the truth that they ask that question and then they go on a quest until they know what the best books are and where they are and till they've studied the best books for themselves.
Right. That's awesome. Something I want to point out, and this is going to just show my personal stupidity and being dumb. A couple of weeks ago, this is maybe a month or two ago now, we were sitting in your office, and you have the Joseph Smith papers up in your bookshelf. And I was like, Brother Harper, how many of those would you say you've read? And you were like, all of them? And it blew my mind for a second because it's so many pages. But as I've conversed with you since then, it is obvious that you know these things. You can cite things left and right. You know so much. And so all this to say you are an authority when it comes to what we're talking about today. You know the source and you know the best books better than just about anybody else that we can talk to.
Well, I certainly, I don't have it all memorized or anything like that. And there are a lot of people who have that same, right, who have that same penchant and same bookshelf. But I would say that I am unsatisfied getting it from any other source. I don't want my truth downstream. So I listen to everything and everyone who has claims on truth, right? I want to hear what people have to say. But I like what President Oaks called at a 2005 Library of Congress symposium on the worlds of Joseph Smith. President Oaks talked about the principle of independent verification by revelation. That is a heritage of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ, and I find it to be the finest epistemology there. Randall Ballmer, a very, very excellent religion scholar, he spoke at the same symposium. And I remember when he was pushed on, how do you know? He evoked the old saying, the Bible, how does it go? I don't say it every day, so I don't remember it. But essentially, the Bible's true, and therefore it's true. The Bible tells me so. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, I couldn't be satisfied with that alone, right? The Bible has lots of challenging problems to it. I believe the Bible, generally speaking, because I believe the Book of Mormon. Because I believe the restored gospel, I have great confidence in the Bible. But if it were the other way around, that wouldn't be enough.
Sure.
So,
and I'd like to say we'll link some of those speeches, that
Great.
symposium in the footnotes, but that's in BYU Studies.
That's right.
A lot of maybe even all of those talks, and a lot of them are in BYU Studies, and you can go and read all of these things. If you really want to know the answers, put forth the work, I guess, is really what I'm trying to say.
Years ago, you remind me of a conversation I had with Dean Jesse years ago. Dean Jesse, for those who don't know, is one of the finest scholars of Joseph Smith ever. He spent years and years in what he called the cage, which is this sort of fenced-in area of the church archive when it was still in the basement of the church administration building at 47 East South Temple Street in Salt Lake City. So he was down there doing archival work, reading the journals of Joseph Smith, discovering first vision accounts that had been sitting on the shelf for 100 years. Mm-hmm. And I asked him one time, I said, why do you think it is that people are sometimes distressed when they find out there are several accounts of the vision or whatever else? And he said, perhaps if they were more inclined to read. Mm-hmm. And there's truth to that, right? People who are not willing to put forth the effort to ask the questions and seek the answers out of the best books. Googling, if you lack wisdom, let them ask Google. That's not adequate. That's not adequate. A truth seeker is not satisfied with that kind of a lame quest. They have to trace the knowledge back to the original and ultimate source. That ultimately takes you to God. I'm frustrated, but also have a great desire to help people who would say, well, okay, but what are the best books? How do I even know? How do I even get started with this stuff? So I don't want to be too hard on folks who are sincerely seeking the truth. Right.
I love that. And I think that this kind of gives us a great intro into what we're talking about today, which is the Book of Mormon Translation.
Awesome.
Now, our last two episodes that you and I did together, we talked about the first vision. And nowadays, that's what most people would say is the beginning of the church, mm-hmm. is the beginning of the restoration. But if we go back in church history, a lot of times we would start with the Book of Mormon. And a lot of times we'd start with that fateful day in September with Angel Moroni appearing to Joseph Smith. I kind of want to start there.
Great.
And let's look in, we're going to be talking about the Book of Mormon Translation, but let's first look at that day and what happened after that until we've got to the point where we now have this 500 and some odd page book in my hands that supposedly is the truest of all books.
Yeah.
So could you start us there? What happened there and kind of where do we go from there?
Well, Joseph Smith gives us a few different variations on what happened. His 1832 autobiography tells the story. His 1838-39 manuscript history tells the story. There's an entry in his journal for November 1835 that tells the story. And then others tell it too. Oliver Cowdery weighs in. So the story goes as Joseph's earliest account. We'll follow it most closely. His 1832 autobiography says that after the vision of the Father and the Son, or as he puts it, the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord, and he said unto me, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. And then a little bit more down the page, he says, my soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy, but I could find no one who would believe the heavenly vision. Then the next line says, after many days I fell into errors and sinned in many things, which brought a wound upon my soul. And he tells us that he knows what to do this time. He goes back to prayer. He goes back to seeking God's forgiveness. It worked before. It filled him with love before. He's going to do the same thing again. This time he receives not only the forgiveness he's seeking, but he receives a commission, a call. He's met by a messenger sent from the presence of God to him. The messenger tells him there's a book deposited, written upon gold plates, buried in a hill not far from where he lives. Joseph, the seer, can see when the angel tells him this is the case. And Joseph by now is a seer, what Dean Jesse might call a lowercase s seer, long before he becomes an uppercase s seer. And in the meantime, in between the first vision and this visit of Moroni, Joseph has apparently discovered a seer stone. He discovers it while he's digging a well for the Chase family. There are different accounts about how it happens. Willard Chase, who's there, gives a self-serving account. He says he was in the well digging while Joseph and his brother were watching, and he brought a stone up out of the well, and Joseph grabbed it, put it in his hat, could see in it when he put his hat up to his face and blocked out the light. Willard demanded the stone back, and Joseph said no. I think Willard is telling us part of what happened. I think it's highly unlikely that Willard hired, or his family hired, Joseph and Alvin to dig a well, and then Willard dug it while Joseph and Alvin stood by.
Yeah, it doesn't make a ton of sense.
I think Joseph was down in that hole, and I think he brought up the stone. And I don't know if this is the fulfillment of Alma 37:23, I think it is, but I like to read these passages together. In that passage, Alma is trying to prepare his son Helaman to become the keeper of the sacred records and the stone interpreters that go with them. And in that charge to Helaman, Alma quotes the Savior, a revelation not attested anywhere else. And he says, Jesus speaking, I will prepare unto my servant Gazalim, a stone that will shine forth in darkness unto light. No one knows for sure how to read that, right? Is the stone named Gazalim? Is the servant called that? We don't know. What we do know is that Joseph Smith identifies with that passage. He sees himself in one sense or another as fulfillment of that. So early on, Joseph discovers this ability to see. His mother knows it. In her memoir, she talks about Josiah Stoll coming to hire Joseph, coming 100 miles to hire Joseph because he has a reputation for being able to see, and he can find things that other people can't find, or see things other people can't see. Martin Harris knows it. Martin tells us that he one day is visiting Joseph, and he wants to sort of test this out. And Martin is picking his teeth with a pin, flips out of his fingers, gets lost on a floor, covered with straw and so forth. And he says, Joseph, let's see what you can do. Joseph takes his stone, puts it in his hat, puts his hat up over his eyes, goes around the room, moves the twigs, picks up the pin, hands it to Martin, all with his eyes covered. And Martin Harris will forever after tell this story and others and say, I know he can see. Josiah Stoll testifies before a justice of the peace. I know he can see. I don't believe it. It's not a matter of belief with me. I know it. Joseph's dad, Joseph Sr., same kind of thing. So we might, in our time and place, say, well, that's dumb. That's silly. That doesn't happen. That doesn't make sense. Well, all we're saying is we don't know, right? I don't know how it makes sense. I don't know how to do that. I'm not a seer. But when we pretend to certainty that these things don't happen or can't happen, we're pretending to be certain about things we're ignorant about. We don't know. We have good evidence that several people who knew Joseph well testified he could see. And there's plenty of other reasons, right, to corroborate that he can see things in specially prepared stones that other people cannot see.
Right.
And we have the Book of Mormon with half a dozen passages in it testifying God prepares stones like this. He does it on purpose so that sacred records encoded in one language and that need to be decoded hundreds of years later in a different language, nobody can read them. Well, a seer can read them. A seer who has a special gift from God. And Joseph Smith will always bear witness. I translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. He evokes that line right out of the Book of Omni in the Book of Mormon. And he associates himself with the brother of Jared, with King Mosiah, others in the Book of Mormon, Alma himself, Helaman, who have this high gift from God and who can see. And people might say, well, that's dumb. I've never seen that before. Again, all we're doing is saying, I'm ignorant, right? And my judgment is it's dumb or it doesn't work. I don't care at all for that, because I have, as you said, a 500+ page book that is the evidence. That book came from somewhere, didn't it, Easton?
I think so.
It came from somewhere. It came off Egbert Grandin's press on the 28th day of March, 1830 in Palmyra, New York. And it was set in type, according to the compositor, John Gilbert, who put it in type. It was set in type from manuscripts provided to him by Oliver Cowdery. Those manuscripts still exist, at least 30% of the original one does, and almost all the printer's manuscript. They're in Oliver Cowdery's hand.
Which, by the way, you can go read at Joseph Smith Papers.
Absolutely. So where did this book come from? Well, it came from Oliver Cowdery's pen, and Oliver always said it came from Joseph Smith's mouth. That's what Joseph Smith said, too. That's what Martin Harris said. That's what Emma Smith said. That's what David Whitmer said. Well, it's not what Eber Howe said. He was the newspaper editor over in Painesville, Ohio. He thought it was all nonsense. So what? How does he know? He has no firsthand knowledge. You can say that's silly, that's dumb, that's crazy. Well, then tell me where the book came from.
Right.
Brian Hales, as you know, wrote this fantastic article, BYU Studies article, where he traced all of the naturalistic explanations for the Book of Mormon over time. And they cycle, right? They cycle and recycle. Right now, the flavor of the month is Joseph did it himself. He had help from Cowdery and others, but he was smart enough and capable enough, and he had a wild imagination. He told stories to his mom and siblings and dad in the nighttime for months and months before he cranked out the Book of Mormon between April 7th and June 11th or so, 1829. Man, that is the least satisfying explanation I can think of, because I don't think anybody who reads the book a lot and reads Joseph Smith's other papers a lot can be very satisfied by that conclusion. It'll pacify you if you don't spend a lot of time in Joseph Smith's papers. But if you read Joseph's first journal entry, 1832, November 1832, where you see that he struggles just to dump out a few coherent thoughts, and then he crosses them out, and he struggles. For 10 days, he makes these terse little entries, and then for 10 months, he quits. Or if you read his 1832 autobiography, right, 6 pages long, starts triumphantly, but by the time we're halfway down the first page, he's saying, look, I barely had a chance to go to school. I barely acquired reading, writing, and arithmetic, and this is not going to sound well. Then he misplaces a modifier right away and makes it sound like when his dad was 10 years old, his dad moved the family to, right? It's whoever composed the Book of Mormon did not compose Joseph Smith's autobiographies, letters, journals. So who did? That's the question. And there's all kinds of, as you know, all kinds of ancient Semitic poetry and literary forms that are still in the Book of Mormon, including some Joseph edited out over time, right, to make it more readable to modern readers. All that's compelling to me, but most of all, it's the spiritual witness. I'm a better follower of Jesus. I'm a better husband, a better dad when I read and abide by the principles of the Book of Mormon, the precepts of the Book of Mormon. It's
powerful. And it goes back to Daniel Kahneman, right? What are the known unknowns?
Yeah.
And we know this thing, but it's hard to figure out how can we know all of the truthfulness of it. But I think a great place to start is to see the other witnesses and who else is there during these translation process and whatever it may be.
Right.
So let's jump in a little bit to the CES letter itself. Cool. And I have a couple of quotes here. And so before we do that, I want to just make sure we clarify a little bit. So Joseph Smith has his first vision,
right?
1820.
Yeah.
What year did he finally receive the Book of Mormon?
He finally received the Book of Mormon in September 1827. He got the plates.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 7 years later.
Yep.
And he finally receives those gold plates. He's with Emma Smith at this time, correct? And does he immediately start translating the plates right after he receives it?
He does not. Immediately, he buries them in a hollowed log. We don't know if this is a log that's laying down, right, or a fork in a tree that's standing. Both of those possibilities have been raised by wise thinkers about this. But he says he leaves them up there somewhere on the hill. He comes home. He shows his mom, at least covered up, the seer stones he's received. He allays her fears that he has failed to acquire the plates at all. He has a little fun with his dad and Joseph Knight and others, where he sulks and he pretends that he failed to get the plates finally and forever, and they say, "Oh, we're sorry," and they said, "Oh, I'm so disappointed." And then he says, "It's 10 times better than I expected," and he describes the plates to them and the Urim and Thummim. So that heavy burden that hangs over him during that probationary period of 4 years, while Moroni pretty much tells him everything he thinks and does, and just keeps such a close watch on him and expects accountability at every turn, and turns him into not just a latent potential seer, but turns him into somebody who's, as Lucy Mack Smith put it, not only willing but able to shoulder the heavy load of being in possession of those plates. So he gets the plates. He doesn't.
And so, real quick, how old was he at the point that he finally received the plates?
Oh, you're asking a math question now. September 27 minus December 05.
22. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. Just dwell on that for just a minute.
That's younger than I am.
That's a lot younger than I am.
Barely.
Yeah. So he's a kid.
Right.
17 when he first hears from Moroni, and he's all the things that a 17-year-old is, and he's also a lot more, right?
And he's going through puberty with an angel looking behind his back, making sure he's doing what he needs to. Yeah.
Martin Harris at one point says Moroni tells him he's got to stop swearing, stealing, hanging out with the treasure diggers. So I think Joseph tries his best. I think it's a heavy load to pass through those 4 years. One thing that our listeners might not know, that the primary sources make crystal clear, is that Joseph does not know it'll be 4 years. Moroni doesn't say, "Son, you have to wait for 4 years to get the plates." He says, "You meet me here every year and we'll evaluate." People might think, Joseph Smith history, verse 53 says plainly 4 years. No. Read that differentiating between factual memory and interpretive memory, right? The verse is about what Joseph Smith remembers Moroni saying at the time, and then right in the middle of the verse, he inserts an interpretive memory, something he knows because now that's, a decade into the rearview mirror. Neither would that time arrive until 4 years had passed. But Joseph does not know in the 1820s, not until the late 1820s, that it'll take 4 years.
And something important to remember about that verse, Joseph Smith history isn't a journal.
Right.
He's not writing that as he goes. This is years after the fact.
Right. Which has its advantages and disadvantages, right? A journal can tell us kinds of knowledge that later records can't, and a journal cannot tell us kinds of knowledge that a later reflection can. So factual memory is sort of what happens at the time. On this day, I saw this thing or went to this place. So an autobiography or letter, something like that, can reflect. It can find meaning in those things that was not available at the time. And both of those kinds of knowledge there are pros and cons, there are strengths and weaknesses. And it's good that you pointed that out. A lot of people, you'll hear people say, when they're talking about any records of church history of the past, they'll call it a journal. And that's dangerous because then you're not aware of the kinds of limits that you have on your source material. If you think everything's a journal, then you're not a very good source critic, and you need to work harder at understanding what the sources of knowledge are and what they can tell you and what they can't. Lucy Mack Smith's memoir, written in the mid-1840s, can tell us a lot of stuff, and it has a lot of limits on what it can reveal to us. And we should take all the source material we have, sum total, and then we should triangulate it. We should read it together. We should test it against all the other sources that we have. And from that emerges the fullest and best and still limited picture. We ought to be very conscious that we cannot know the whole story. And it's audacious of us and irresponsible for us to think that we know more than we know.
Right.
But same token, I testify that we can know a lot. It is well documented. Man, I started out in ancient history. If ancient history scholars had as much documentation as we have of the Restoration, they would be giddy. They'd be delighted, and they just simply don't. So we're blessed with a lot of good source material, but we have to use it like tobacco. You know what I mean by that?
No.
With judgment and skill, like the Word of Wisdom says.
Sure.
So that's how tobacco and historical source material are the same, to be used with judgment and skill.
It's a great analogy. I love it. Okay, so 1827, Joseph Smith finally receives it.
Yeah.
This is in September.
Right.
At what point does he finally start the translation process?
Well, he doesn't get a good start on it. Nothing happens there in Manchester, where he lives. There are people he used to search for buried treasure with that feel like he has forsaken them, right? Moroni has told him, you've got to stop hanging out with that group. You are not getting this stack of plates to have a treasure. This has the fullness of the gospel, and I will not. You think of Moroni while he's alive, he writes into the plates a blessing for Joseph Smith. Blessed be he that shall bring this thing to light. But if you think you're going to get it for getting gain, if you think my ancestors and me, gave our lives so that you could take this record to the pawn shop, no chance. I'm paraphrasing there. But Moroni in the book itself talks to the future Joseph, blesses him, and then makes sure that he knows there's no chance you're going to get this for getting gain. So Joseph has to distance himself from the treasure seekers, and they come after him. They try to get the plates, just as Moroni promised him. As long as he exerts all his power to protect them, the plates remain safe in his hands. But he has to move to Pennsylvania. He and Emma make plans to move down to live adjacent to her parents. They reconcile with her parents. They're welcomed warmly there, and they start to buy a little home across the way there from Emma's folks, and that's where Joseph and Emma start translating. We know that he copies characters from the plates and also his best effort to translate them, and that Martin Harris then takes that to the wise men of the East, as Professor Richard Bennett calls them, not just Professor Charles Anton at Columbia or King's College, but others, Samuel Mitchell, others, and everybody says, I can't read it. I can't read it. Martin Harris comes back from that trip more convinced than ever that Joseph will be the one to read it. And Joseph's earliest autobiography at this point tells us, the Lord had prepared spectacles to read the book, and therefore I commenced. And somewhere along the way here, he realizes that he is the fulfillment of Isaiah 29. It may not be until he's translating the small plates near the end of the translation process, but he realizes that, as the Lord puts it there, speaking through Isaiah, the smartest guy in the world can't read it. The unlearned can't read it. I will bring forth the marvelous work, and I'll do it through my unlearned servant to show the world that it's my work, my book. So that's sort of the way things get started. Emma does some of the scribing. Martin Harris does. You know the story about Martin doing a whole bunch of writing, and then Joseph being persuaded eventually by Martin to let him take the manuscript home. He loses it. I love the way the Lord solves that problem. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, let's do it. Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of people know this story, but what we might draw to folks' attention if they don't know is the way the conspiracy gets foiled. We don't know who steals the manuscript pages. Lucy Harris, Martin's wife, is accused. The Lord in the Revelation, Doctrine and Covenants 10, says wicked men. So it's hard to know for sure. Nobody's ever been positively identified, but somebody steals these pages from Martin Harris, and Joseph is worried that he wants to fix this problem, right? He wants to fix what he did wrong. He asks the Lord about that, and the Lord says, no, there's a conspiracy afoot. Let me tell you how it's going down. The folks who stole these pages are waiting for you to publish. And if you publish the exact same thing, they're going to change what they've got, publish it, and say he can't do it the same way twice. If you publish something different than what they stole, they're going to publish what they stole and say he can't do it the same way twice. He's not a real prophet. You can't trust him. So the Lord undercuts them by saying, Joseph, don't translate it over again. I anticipated this a long time ago, and I had Nephi make a whole other record, and it's got everything you need. 1,000 years later, I had Mormon include it, and neither one of them knew why they were doing what they were doing. They did it because I told them to. And so you've got everything you need in the Book of Mormon. It will fulfill its promises to the engravers, and it will thwart the conspiracy. And Joseph, I think it's verse 35 in Doctrine and Covenants 10, where the Lord says, I will show unto them that my wisdom is greater than the cunning of the devil. And Joseph uses this revelation to draft a preface for the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. And there's no records of this, right? Nobody's going to go on record saying what happened, but I have in my imagination that the conspirators walk into Grandin's bookshop maybe on the 28th of March, 1830, and eagerly grab one, right? Crack it open, have a look. The first thing they're going to see in the book is them being exposed.
Right.
And you're going to close that book, put it back on the shelf, and never say a word ever to anyone because you've been had. You've been bested. The Lord has showed that his cunning, his wisdom rather, is greater than your cunning. So that foiled that plot. And from there on, Joseph continued, brought forth the Book of Mormon by the power of God. It's often these days, it's, excuse me. Why don't you say something? I'll quit talking for a while.
No, you're good. So I guess are you cool if we read a couple quotes from the CES letter? And I just want to hear your thoughts. Number one, I love this paragraph because I think a lot of people probably feel this way when it comes to this. Jeremy Reynolds in the CES letter, he says, unlike the story I've been taught in Sunday school, priesthood, general conferences, seminary, EFY, ensigns, church history tours, the MTC, and BYU, Joseph Smith used a rock in a hat for translating the Book of Mormon. That's the part I like because I know myself growing up, I felt that same way of, wait, what is this? And let me continue before you start talking about that. He continues, I don't like this part as much. He says, in other words, Joseph used the same magic device or Ouija board that he used during his treasure hunting days. He put a rock called a peepstone in his hat and put his face in the hat to tell his customers the location of buried treasure on the property. He also used the same method for translating the Book of Mormon while the gold plates were covered, placed in another room, or even buried in the woods. The gold plates were not used for the Book of Mormon we have today. In my brain, growing up, now, as I've studied, I've recognized it's not this. But in my brain growing up, I imagine those pictures of Joseph Smith sitting down, gold plates in front of him. Sometimes he has glasses on, and it literally looks like what you look like sitting and reading a book. He's just going through and saying it out loud, and Oliver Cowdery, whoever the scribe is, writes it as they go. What is the deal with the translation? Did he have a rock and a hat? What did it look like?
What a fantastic question. Let's spend a lot of time on this. Okay. So first thing is that the first part of what Jeremy said there is objective facts, right? When I went to EFY, this is what I got. When I read the Book of Mormon Reader as a kid, it had Joseph Smith wearing the spectacles on the breastplate. Fantastic article a few years ago, Joseph the Seer in the church magazines by Rick Turley and Mark Ashurst McGee, I think, maybe Robin Jensen as well, showed what really happened, and then had several of these art pieces that we've seen. I think there's still one on page 48 of Preach My Gospel. Now, we should say that it's not an uninterrupted chain of images that don't match the historical record, because in September 1974, when I was 4 years old, the Friend magazine for kids had this wonderful article in it about Joseph Smith using a seer stone, a chocolate-colored seer stone, to bring forth the Book of Mormon. So somebody was getting more of the historical record into it. But it is the case, as Jeremy says well there, that he and I and most of us have grown up, those of us who haven't come around in the last 10 years, have grown up with this image of two stones. Joseph wears them like glasses, and he's looking right at the plates through the stones, and he can read them that way. And that, for some reason, is comfortable. If you've come of age with that story, you accept it, right? Generally speaking. But then what happens is you find out more facts, and they complexify this narrative. And those facts include that witnesses who watched Joseph do it said, oh, he used a single stone, sometimes, if not all the time. And he would put it in his hat. He'd hold his hat up to his eyes to block out the light. And he would dictate the Book of Mormon without ever looking at the plates. The plates didn't even have to be uncovered, right? They could be wrapped up.
So pause right there. Do we know what type of hat it was? Was it like a big Abraham Lincoln top hat, or do we know?
The only source that I know of that mentions anything about it says the old white hat.
Okay.
And Mark Staker is the one who does all the work to figure out that kind of stuff. So at the Book of Mormon Translation site, Priesthood Restoration site in in Harmony, Pennsylvania, I think the hat there is this old white hat that they think of as closest to what they could find. I think Mike McKay and Garrett Dirkmott, too, have done work on that, too. So the movie that plays at that visitor center depicts that. So, in other words, I don't know for sure what kind of hat it is, but there are people who've studied that and figured it out as best we can these days. Now, what I want to notice here is that the first thing you read from Jeremy is a series of objective facts, right? I don't know if objective is the right word, but he was reporting facts as he received them. There was no bias in that passage. It was his lived experience. When you shifted to the second part of the statement, you notice that he started freighting it with words that have negative connotations, right? He started doing interpretive work. He started prejudicing how we would understand it. Read that again, and let's pick out all those words that have peepstone, right? Magic, Ouija board.
So he says, in other words, Joseph used the same magic device or Ouija board that he used during his treasure hunting days.
Yeah.
Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, so let's notice here that these words become negatively connotated for our time. These are words that have negative connotations in our time that didn't have negative connotations 500 years ago. Lots of good work on this by Alan Taylor, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian of Joseph's culture, and others. Richard Bushman certainly have shown that magic, right? Magic today, if I went out today and said, I really believe that I can do magic, everybody's going to think negatively about that. Now, they might pay me for a magic show if they realize I'm just doing tricks and it's for entertainment. But if I claim to really be able to do magic, that's a negative connotated word. Not so much 500 years. How do we know that? Well, no less than Isaac Newton, right? Is a magician, an alchemist, a sorcerer, and maybe the world's greatest scientist. And in Isaac Newton's time and place, those are not antithetical things. That is all the same kind of way of thinking. So that word magic has become negatively connotated over time. And Jeremy evokes it for its negative power. Right? In Joseph's own time, a guy named Abraham Benton did this with the word necromancy, right? And occult is a similar word occult didn't used to necessarily mean negative. It meant sort of secret knowledge, not positively or negatively charged. But what Jeremy's doing there is he's given a negative charge to the whole thing. And what you and I want to do is be metacognitive enough to say, I don't want Jeremy deciding this for me, right? I want to decide for myself if the Book of Mormon is magic, peepstone, right? I want, I don't want a prejudiced view of it. I want the raw sources. I want the raw materials. I want to know what they say. And I want to evaluate them for myself. And I'm happy to know what Jeremy says, but I don't want to be dependent on what Jeremy says or anyone else. I want the Book of Mormon and the sources that tell me where it came from. The eyewitnesses, right? Can I trust them or not? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to read them before I decide that.
Right.
I'm going to get back to the raw material before I listen to anybody tell me about something that's so consequential as this.
I love that. And I think that's the important thing that we need to recognize here. And also, another quote that Jeremy has in here that I feel for him. He says, although again, there's these words are harsh words that he's trying to convey a specific type of meaning. He says, since learning this disturbing new information and feeling betrayed, I have been attacked and gaslighted by revisionist Mormon apologists claiming that it's my fault and the fault of anyone else for not knowing this. The information was there all along, they say. You should have known this, they claim.
Yeah, and I feel for him too, right? I don't doubt what he's saying here, and that's very sad. This is why we're doing this, because there are many people in his shoes, and you and I are here because we wish in the bottom of our hearts that we could have been available, or that, he reached out in absolute sincerity for somebody who could help him with these confusing things. And he didn't get it. He didn't get what he needed. And that's the whole reason for this podcast, is to hopefully gesture to him and everyone else that being gaslit is not the way.
Right.
And blaming someone who didn't know where to look or what to do is not the way. My heart's heavy as a result.
And one thing I do like that he says immediately after that, he says, respected LDS historian and scholar Richard Bushman understands the problem. Unlike these gaslighting revisionist apologists, he has compassion, understanding, and empathy for those who are shocked to learn this faith-challenging information. And just
Jeremy's right about that.
Yeah, just a little teaser. Richard Bushman is coming on our podcast within the next couple months. I know, crazy. It's not like you hooked me up with him or anything. But Richard Bushman is one of the best.
Absolutely.
And I'm excited for him to come on, and he'll be talking a lot about testimony and spiritual witness, and I'm excited for that. So we only have a couple more minutes, so let's finish up here talking about the Book of Mormon. And I guess, again, we encourage our listeners to go and study this on their own. We're going to have a letter written by you talking about this, and we will have footnotes full of additional resources that they can go in. But Jeremy Reynolds, in his article, he quotes Joseph Fielding McConkie and Jared Osler, who wrote an essay, and he has a big, long quote from it. I'm not going to read the entire quote, but essentially it's talking about how there couldn't have been a stone in the hat, and that's not true. That's not correct. Was there a stone in the hat? How in the world do we have Bruce R. McConkie's son coming out and saying, no way, Jose?
Well, for a long time, lots of folks, not historians typically, right? Not people trained in the historical method and so forth, but authorities, right? Teachers, they denied it for a long, long time. There's still some headwinds that blow I published an article in the Ensign magazine a few years ago, Joseph Smith's early experience with Revelation. And you don't do that and have it not approved at the highest levels of the church. But there was blowback from that. Right? I just published an article on Joseph Smith a treasure seeker and got negative feedback on that. And Hugh Nibley went a long way to demolish any confidence in seer stones and Joseph as a treasure digger. So there's a long tradition of, Joseph's name being had for good and evil. So the evil comes, and then you've got apologists who answer that back and say, nuh-uh, none of this is. Well, it turns out that we overshot, right? We said things that haven't held up well. I have a principle that I try to follow, which is to not defend turf that's indefensible and that doesn't matter, right? Is there a stone in a hat? Yeah, the historical evidence overwhelmingly says so. But whether there is or not, ultimately isn't the thing. The Book of Mormon is the thing, right? Measure the Book of Mormon for what it is, what it says. Whether it was translated by Joseph Smith doing cartwheels, while he looked at a stone in a hat or whatever else, if it's true, then it doesn't matter how it was translated. We have missed the forest for the trees. We have made an error when we focus too much on how it was translated. It was translated by the gift and power of God. And then if we decide, well, I know I'm a good authority on what the gift and power of God must be like. 2 stones in a set of glasses he found led by an angel. I'm okay with that, but not 1 stone in a hat. Why not? Alma 37 says we could have 1 stone in a hat. Who cares, in a sense? Like we're just pretending to be rational. We're making cognitive illusions for ourselves when we say, well, it could have been this, but not that. It could be this marvelous, but not that marvelous. That's past the limit of my acceptable marvelousness. No, go all the way with marvelous work. Go all the way, whatever that is. Joseph Smith brought forth the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God. That is a measurable declaration, measurable by reading that book with an open heart, a sincere heart, real intent, faith in Jesus Christ, asking, seeking to know if it's about him. The book is about Christ, and when we make it about anything else, we're going to miss the mark, as the book says, right? Don't miss the mark. So that's my emphasis is give it a chance. Give the Book of Mormon a chance, and don't pretend to be the litmus test of what's reasonable and rational and possible and so forth. Well, if the book is true, then virgin birth and resurrection from the dead after atoning for the sins of all mankind is not only possible, it's done. It's finished. That is glorious good news.
Powerful. Steve, we just need to take a picture of just what you just said right there. That was incredible. The other thing I personally would like to point out, and I've said this so many times on this podcast, and I will continue to say this probably every episode, we are dealing with spiritual things. We're not dealing with scientific things, though we can look at these scientifically, and we can look at these things as historians. But these are spiritual things, and in order to know spiritual things, you need to put forth some spiritual effort.
Sure.
And on our Instagram, we have dozens of comments of people bringing up other random stuff while they do it. Well, isn't it wacky that he would look, one of the posts I saw or comments I saw today said something to the effect, isn't it wacky to think that he would just look in a hat and do it? Sure, maybe. Yeah, great. I think you look at most religions and there's going to be wacky things.
Right.
But that's God.
Yeah.
It's different than us as human beings because it's God. He's omnipotent. It's not going to be exactly with how our brainwaves work.
Yeah. We again, we create cognitive illusions. We make ourselves think that we're some sort of an objective standard of what's acceptable or possible or not, right? Wacky. What does that mean? It's a word I can use. I can arbitrarily apply it to anything I think is abnormal. Well, that's a strange standard. Imagine somebody imagine explaining an airplane to someone 300 years ago. I'm going to make this thing out of immense amounts of steel, and it will fly through the air. You're wacky, Easton. Imagine explaining an iPhone 50 years ago.
Imagine explaining a Doritos Locos Tacos to somebody 300 years ago. Imagine explaining that to Brigham Young. Yes, there's these nacho cheese chips full of... They wouldn't be able to fathom it. It's just so different today than it was 200 years ago.
It is. So what we're saying, in other words, is there's not an objective standard that runs consistently through time of wackiness or reality. And it works the other direction too, right? Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and others use divining rods. And from my perspective, I say, that's wacky, that's goofy. That's just me not knowing how their stuff works, how their version of an iPhone works. Same with the seer stone, right? I can't wait to get a seer stone. Doctrine Comes says if I behave myself well, I get one someday. I have no idea how it works, but I don't decide that I'm smart enough to know how everything works. I have faith. The Book of Mormon came from somewhere. The best evidence, all the evidence says it came from Joseph Smith as he translated by the gift and power of God. Well, I'm going to give that a chance because it is great. It's not only true to the historical record, it's true to the truth. True to the truth and true to the redemption that I find in Christ. So I'm going to go with that.
I love that, Steve. As we conclude, do you have any final thoughts when it comes to the Book of Mormon translation? Anything for these people, for our truth seekers who have cognitive dissonance, who feel like they maybe have been gaslit before? What do you have for them?
I don't doubt that folks have been gaslit, right, and have been given bad intel, but there's no reason to then perpetuate that, right? So you've been gaslit. I'm sorry about that, but don't then give yourself over to that, right? Refuse to be gaslit. And so you've been given bad intel. Well, go find the good intel. There's plenty of sources now. It was harder a decade ago, 2 decades ago, to find the real stuff. But now it's on the church's website. It's on the Joseph Smith Papers website. It's on the film that plays at the visitor center at Harmony, The Stone in the Hat, and you can see that video online. You don't have to go to Harmony, Pennsylvania to see it. So this stuff is much easier to find these days. And what I'm afraid of is that people who feel like they were betrayed by the church, John DeLynn or Jeremy Reynolds, I worry that they're done giving the church a chance, right? They're done being open to the possibility. If so, I invite them to open their heart a little and come and see. Maybe there's something there. I mean, Don Bradley's been there, done that, right?
Which, by the way, we'll be interviewing Don Bradley.
Yeah. You're not alone if you feel like you were betrayed and you feel like your faith was shattered and left you cold, and then you find it rekindled and you find your way back. That's an increasingly common story we're hearing, and I love that story. It's a good one, so I hope I hear more and more of it.
I love that story too, Steve. I want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for your expertise and for your knowledge. When it comes to these things, you're very helpful, and I hope that you've been able to give a good perspective to some of our listeners today. And as we conclude, our invitation, as always, is to not just take our word for it, but to continue your study. Make sure to go to CESletters.org, where we have different articles and different resources so that you can further your study when it comes to this. But make sure to bring the Spirit into it. Make sure to pray about it as you continue your study out of the best books. Do you have any final thoughts?
Thanks, Easton. I appreciate what you do.
Thank you, Steve. We'll talk to you guys next time.